It started with a whisper in the hallway of a prison, one guard to another with wide eyes and a low voice. Then there was frantic radio chatter and the banging of metal bars. But what if I told you that someone had warned this would happen, but no one listened? Why did Chumley say, if he talks, they'll kill him? And why is Rick Harrison now fighting for his life in jail, accused of trafficking, betrayal, and secrets darker than anything we saw on TV? When the emergency team got to the cell block, the damage was already done. Rick Harrison, the famous face behind Pawn Stars, was lying on the cold floor of his lone cell, bleeding and whispering his son's name. Before we go any further, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Corey Harrison didn't hear it until hours later. He was sitting at his kitchen counter with a cup of coffee he never had before. Got the call. At first, he didn't believe it. He thought it was a cruel joke that made sense given everything going on with his father. Then prison officials confirmed it. His father had been stabbed. He was still alive, but barely, and Corey's world fell apart in an instant. But what if it wasn't random? What if someone wanted Rick dead not for what he had done, but for what he might say? This story isn't about a TV star who fell from grace. It's about betrayal and secrets, fame, and a dark warning from someone who saw it all coming. That someone was Chumley. Came before Rick was sentenced, before the charges of human trafficking and money laundering made national news, before the courtroom cameras and tearful family testimonies. There was a quiet moment between Chumley and Corey. At the time, Corey didn't understand the warning, but now it makes more sense than ever. Tell your dad to shut up. If he talks in there, they won't let him leave. Everyone was nervous and guessing what was going on with Chumley, who had been acting strangely and emotionally in the weeks before the trial. But now that Rick is in a hospital wing of a high-security prison stitched together and heavily guarded, Corey is looking at that warning in a whole new way. And for the first time since the sentencing, Corey Harrison is talking about the fear, suspicion, and full truth behind his father's imprisonment and the brutal attack that followed. Let's go back to Rick Harrison. He wasn't just a TV personality. He was a brand, a cultural icon, and the strict, no-nonsense head of the gold and silver pawn shop in Las Vegas. He built a multi-million-dollar empire from old coins and dusty antiques. People loved him. Tourists would wait in line every day to get a glimpse of him behind the glass counter. But behind the scenes, something much darker was happening. And if you listen to Corey now, you'll hear him say that it was obvious. He wasn't just buying and selling antiques. I didn't want to believe it at first, but the signs were there, and now I can see it. The accusations shocked the country. Rick Harrison, who used to be America's favorite reality dad, was accused of running a trafficking ring out of his pawn shop. The FBI had been spying on him for years, with undercover agents pretending to be buyers, sellers, and surveillance cameras. Financial records were also requested, but Harrison refused to turn them over. One of his former employees turned informant, and when the hammer fell, it hit with a force that no one saw coming. He was charged with money laundering, tax evasion, and worst of all, human trafficking. The trial was covered by every news outlet, from TMZ to CNN. People couldn't decide whether to cry or be angry. How could a man who made us laugh every night on the History Channel be capable of something so bad? Rick denied it all, even when the evidence was clear. He kept his head up and his jaw clenched as the evidence was shown on the courtroom projector. He said it was a smear campaign by jealous competitors, angry ex-employees, and grumpy acquaintances who wanted to ruin him, but the jury wasn't convinced. There was too much evidence. When the guilty verdict was read, the room went silent. The man who used to be known for his jokes and haggling was now a convicted felon sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Corey didn't talk to reporters at the time. A pale, shaking man who was angry at his father, not the system, I asked Corey. Now I asked him to come clean before it went to trial. I told him, if there's anything, tell me now. Let me help you before it's too late. but he looked me straight in the eyes and said, "There's nothing to tell." I stopped believing him after that. You can see Corey's sadness in his eyes, his voice shakes, but it's his tone that really gets you. It's not just sadness, it's anger at the betrayal and what his father's actions have done to their family. He rants that maybe, just maybe, someone inside that prison knew things the rest of the world didn't know and tried to silence Rick before he could speak out. Because here's the thing, Rick Harrison didn't die, but he was supposed to. Corey says that the stab wounds weren't supposed to kill him. He says the stab wounds were meant to kill, not scare someone. They were aimed at the heart, neck, and lungs, and here's the real twist, no one saw it. There were no cameras working in that corner of the wing, no guards nearby, and no witnesses. Rick was attacked alone in a secure area with a weapon that hasn't been found. The official prison report calls it an attempted murder that is being investigated, but Corey isn't waiting for an investigation. Someone inside that prison wanted him dead, he says, and I think it's someone who doesn't want him to testify. Testify about what? That's the $1,000,000 question, or maybe the $1,000,000,000 question. For the past few weeks, rumors have been going around that Rick had been contacted by federal investigators again, but this time from a different branch. Some say it was Homeland Security, while others say it was a deep internal task force looking into a larger ring linked to several trafficking, whatever the case. Sources say Rick was about to make a deal that would connect the dots, reveal names, and make deals. But before he could do that, he was attacked. This brings us back to Chun-Li. Since Rick's conviction, Chun-Li, who used to be the comedic relief on Pawn Stars, has been mostly quiet. But Corey says there was more to Chun-Li than meets the eye. People thought he was the goofy sidekick, Corey said in a private podcast appearance. But Chun-Li was paying attention. He saw things I didn't, and it's still not clear what Chun-Li knew. But Corey thinks that Chun-Li's warning was based on real knowledge of the criminal groups Rick is said to be a part of and how those groups treat informers. Now Rick is lying in a prison hospital, bloodied, bruised, and silent. The man who used to run a shop full of treasures is now fighting for breath, life, and survival, and his son Corey stands outside the system screaming into the void, hoping that someone will listen. "I don't know what my father did or didn't do anymore," Corey says, his eyes wide. "I'm sure he's not safe, and if they came for him once, they'll come again." This isn't just a story about a TV star. It's also about the weight of truth, the painful realization that sometimes the people you love the most are the ones who bring monsters to your door. And as Corey paces the floor of his dimly lit living room, thinking about his last conversation with Chun-Li, one phrase keeps coming back to him. They won't let him leave, he didn't. The courtroom was silent, but not because of politeness or respect. It was the eerie, heavy silence of disbelief that happens when everyone in the room realizes they're about to witness something historic and irreversible. It was the last day of Rick Harrison's trial, and no one there, not a juror, not a reporter, not a member of the public, could have predicted how far this story would go from its TV beginnings. Rick stood there with his arms crossed and his jaw clenched on his side, the confidence he used to wear like armor on TV, and the smirk he used when haggling with customers over Civil War rifles or rare baseball carts were gone. Instead, he stood there in a navy blue suit that didn't fit right, his face pale, his hair a little messy, and his eyes empty. Even then, it looked like he hadn't fully accepted that this was his fate, that his name, which used to be linked to the glitz of Las Vegas and loved by millions of people, would now be forever scarred with words like trafficker, ringleader, and predator. As the judge, a strict woman in her 60s with a very sharp voice, read the verdict, she barely looked at Rick. There was no dramatic pause or cinematic flourish, just the words, cold, deliberate, final. "We the jury find the defendant Rick Harrison guilty on all counts." It hit like a hammer, and Rick didn't move. Across the aisle, Corey Harrison fell into his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the bench as if he were trying to keep himself from falling through the earth. Chumley, sitting 3 rows behind, bowed his head. Others just gasped or sat in shock. The charges were laid out like chapters in a scary book: money laundering, fraud, racketeering, and human trafficking. The last charge, human trafficking, broke any sympathy that people might have had left. Rick had been found guilty of setting up a system where vulnerable people, many of whom were undocumented immigrants or runaways, were taken through his business and given to third-party clients under the guise of fake jobs or security. It turned out that the pawn shop wasn't just a place to buy gold, silver, or old clocks. It was also a hub for something much darker. During the trial, the prosecution used damning evidence, including testimony from former employees, bank records showing shell accounts used to move large amounts of money offshore, surveillance footage of late-night deliveries that never made it onto the books, and most shockingly, a recovered ledger from Rick's office that had names, dates, and coded transactions directly linked to Rick's defense team. Tried everything. They said the ledger was fake, that multiple people got into Rick's office, and that the bank accounts were run by outside financial consultants. But with each counterargument came stronger evidence, more convincing witness statements, and a closing argument from the prosecution that left the jury visibly shaken. He built an empire, voice rising, not just of wealth but of exploitation. He used his fame to shield himself, to mask the people were being bought and sold right under his shop's roof, while people in America laughed at his jokes on TV. The jury deliberated for just 6 hours. When they handed down the sentence of life in prison without the chance of parole, Rick blinked slowly once. He didn't cry or beg. He just whispered something that no one could quite hear. Later, Corey said he mouthed the words, "Tell the truth." But whose truth is it? The court's, or another truth yet to come to light? What happened outside the courthouse was unlike anything Las Vegas had seen in years. Fans pressed crowds of protesters, and signs that said "Justice for the Voiceless" fought with others that yelled "Free Rick." A man in a Pawn Stars t-shirt sobbed openly into a reporter's mic, swearing Rick was framed. Another woman, holding up a missing person flyer, screamed that she knew one of the girls whose name was in Rick's ledger. Social media exploded. #PawnCars trended for hours. Memes flooded timelines. Some mocked Rick, others mourned the betrayal. One particularly chilling post featured a still of Rick's mug shot beside a quote from an early episode: "You never know what's going to walk through that door." Underneath it, someone had written, "Neither did they, but what about Corey?" In the days that followed, Corey Harrison disappeared from public view, not because he was hiding, but because he was falling apart. Friends later said that he had locked himself in his house for almost a week, not talking to anyone. No calls, texts, or emails, just silence. As the son of a man who was now seen as a monster, Corey was suddenly faced with questions he couldn't answer. Had he really not known? Had he ignored signs? Had he in some unconscious way made it happen? "I didn't see it," he later said in an interview weeks after the incident. "Or maybe I didn't want to see it. Maybe I was so focused on the cameras, the brand, and the deals that I didn't notice what was going on behind the counters. I thought it was just a business. I didn't think it was a cage." Chumley, for his part, refused most interviews, but paparazzi caught him muttering under his breath as he walked to his car, "I told him to get out while he could." The clip went viral, and theories grew. The court documents released weeks after the sentence revealed even more horrifying details, detailing encrypted emails, bank transfers connected to known criminal groups, and references to inventory that prosecutors said meant people broke the public's last bit of tolerance. It was then revealed that the trafficking may have begun long before the show aired, meaning Pawn Stars wasn't just a cover. It was a way to build a reputation that made the crime seem unthinkable. No one wanted to believe it. But the facts were chillingly clear. Then there were reports from inside the prison. Upon being moved to the high-security federal facility, rumors of death threats started to spread. Inmates called him the merchant, and guards overheard conversations about a bounty. Some thought Rick had already tried to make a deal with the FBI from behind bars, giving names in exchange for protection. Others said he was acting like he still ran things and wouldn't humble himself. But the stabbing, which happened just 8 days after being put in the protective wing, sealed the deal. No longer was it just a trial or proving blame or innocence. It was about staying alive. When Corey faced the cameras for the first time since the attack, one asked, "What would you say to your dad right now if he were watching?" "Don't hold back," I told him. Silence didn't save him then, and it won't save him now. The sentencing was meant to be the end, but it was only the beginning. The camera slowly zoomed in on Corey Harrison's face as he spoke. The man sat down across from the reporter. His hands were moving around a bit, and his eyes looked tired, but not from lack of sleep. They looked tired from something deeper, like shock, disappointment, and heartbreak. He wasn't dressed like the Corey that most fans remembered from the show. He wasn't wearing baseball caps, biker jackets, or casual swagger. Instead, he was wearing a gray hoodie and jeans, and his face was pale and his mood was tense. This man had reached a breaking point. The interviewer was an experienced reporter from a major news outlet. The moment the camera's red light flashed, outlet didn't waste any time with small talk. She leaned in and asked the question that everyone wanted to hear. "Why now, Corey? Why break your silence after all this time?" "Because I have nothing to lose," he said with a long, shaky breath. That sentence hung in the air for a moment before the interview resumed, and with it came a storm of shocking revelations that no one saw coming. Corey had been quiet for months, while the media tore his family apart and social media broke down every second of his past TV appearances. Corey had completely pulled away from public life. There were rumors that he was hiding or had left the country, but he had actually been in Las Vegas fighting a different kind of prison, his mind. In the interview, Corey talked about revealed that he had been dealing with crippling guilt and confusion ever since his father was arrested. The day the FBI raided the shop still haunted him. He said, his voice barely above a whisper, "Agents with guns slamming doors, grabbing files, and dragging people out. I just stood there and watched as everything I had built with my dad fell apart. But it wasn't just the raid that broke Corey, it was the questions, the accusations, and the betrayals that followed. I kept telling myself, this can't be real. This isn't my dad, he's too strict. This is a hustler. This is a criminal. This is something you hear about in movies, not my dad." But the evidence kept building, the ledgers, the surveillance, the missing people, the money trails, and then the guilty verdict. Still Corey, he kept hoping that some part of the puzzle was wrong and that his father had been framed, tricked, or coerced, until the letters started coming in. "I got a letter from a woman in Arizona who claimed to have worked for my dad back in 2010. She said he offered her a job but then forced her into something else, something dark. At first he didn't believe her, but then more letters came from women, men, and families of the missing. Some of them had details I couldn't explain away." Corey leaned as he spoke. He leaned forward in his chair and gripped the arms of it as if he were bracing for what he was about to say. "I read all of those letters. Some were angry, some were desperate, and some just wanted answers. And somewhere in the middle of reading them all, I realized I didn't know who my father really was." He stopped for a moment, his eyes missing. "You think you know someone your whole life, then the world shows you another version of them, a version you never imagined," he said. 2 pictures. Corey said he found some old notebooks in his dad's garage after the sentencing. Inside were scribbled names, numbers, maps, and coded language. At first, he thought they were just random notes, maybe show props or personal locks. But when he started comparing the names in the notebooks to the names in the letters he got, something chilling clicked. The names kept matching, and that's when it hit me. My dad wasn't just accused, he was deeply involved. Even in the face of overwhelming evidence made it hard for Corey to process. He still remembered the man who taught him how to ride a bike, grilled steaks in the backyard, and brought him souvenirs from his travels. That father, the one no one saw, was still alive in his memories, and it made the reality so much harder to accept. I still wake up some mornings hoping this is all a dream and that he'll be laughing about some crazy mix-up when I walk into the shop, but he's not. The interviewer changed the subject and asked Corey about his relationship with Chumley. Were the rumors true that Chumley had warned Corey about Rick's connections before the trial? Corey replied, "Yes, Chum did warn me a couple of times, but I thought he was just paranoid. I mean, he's always been a bit strange, but he told me that Rick dealt with people who weren't in the pawn world, and that sometimes business meetings were code for something else." Corey admitted that he ignored the warnings because he didn't want to believe them, but now they were ringing in his head like alarm bells that he had ignored for too long. "I think Chum knew more than he let on. Maybe he was afraid, maybe he was involved at one point but pulled out, I don't know. But right before Dad went in, he told me if he talks, they'll kill him. I didn't understand it at the time, but now I do. The attack in prison changed everything." Corey said that when he got the call, he was with his cousin trying to make plans to move out of Nevada. "My phone rang. It was a blocked number. The voice just said, 'Your father has been stabbed.' That was it, nothing else." I knew right then that this wasn't random, it was planned. Since the attack, Corey has been in constant contact with Rick's lawyers and prison officials. He's been asking for an investigation. He says he doesn't think the investigation into the stabbing will lead anywhere. They say it was an inmate acting randomly, but there were no cameras in that area, no guards saw anything, and no weapon was found. That's not random, that's surgical. The part of the interview that shocked most people was when Corey said he thought someone outside the prison might have helped plan the attack from inside. "My dad had secrets, and I think he was ready to spill them," he said. Maybe not out of guilt, but out of survival. If he didn't talk, he'd die in silence, but someone spoke up before he could say a word. What this meant was shocking. Was Rick Harrison a link in a much bigger chain? Were other famous people or institutions involved in the crimes Rick had been convicted of? Had he become a liability to powerful people? Corey wouldn't say who they were, but he didn't rule it out either. All he would say is, "The rabbit hole doesn't end with my father." As the interview came to a close, Corey looked first time speaking directly into the camera. "I'm speaking now because silence didn't protect my dad, it won't protect me, and it certainly won't bring justice to the people who were hurt. If I can do anything now, anything at all, it's to make sure the truth doesn't stay buried." He slowly stood up, his hands still shaking. "I don't expect forgiveness or sympathy, but I do expect the world to start asking the questions it was too afraid to ask before." Corey Harrison then walked out of the studio without any security or an entourage. He was just a man who was haunted by his father's sins and determined to keep the truth alive no matter what. It was a gray morning at Black Ridge Correctional Facility, a high-security prison known for housing some of the most dangerous and controversial inmates in the country. Rain was tapping rhythmically against the small forced windows of Cell Block F, casting a somber mood across the prison. As usual, guards walked the halls while inmates shuffled to and from breakfast, some whispering to each other behind closed doors. But at 9:12 a.m., everything changed. An alarm rang through the East Wing. It wasn't the normal buzzer for head counts or lockdowns. This one was urgent and sharp, meant to let everyone know that an inmate was down and needed help right away. Rick Harrison was bleeding out in cell F-112, and when guards reached him, he was lying on his back near the corner of his bunk. Blood pooled under his torso and spread to the drain in the middle of the floor. His prison shirt was torn open, showing deep puncture wounds on his right shoulder and lower back. He was breathing shallowly, with one hand trembling and twitching while the other held his ribs. He was in shock, and the paramedics stationed inside the facility were called right away. Within minutes, they stabilized Rick as best they could. As they bandaged his wounds, gave him a temporary blood pressure reading, and rushed him to the hospital, where he would spend the next 48 hours under guarded sedation. But things got even stranger. Official reports that were later found showed that there were no working surveillance cameras in that wing at the time of the incident, and several guards had taken unplanned breaks. Most disturbingly, the weapon that was used, Some kind of sharpened plastic melted and shaped into a crude blade, was never found. No one heard screams or saw anything, and no one claimed responsibility or gave a tip. It was like Rick had been attacked by a ghost. The event caused a lot of talk in the prison. Some inmates said Rick had been attacked because he was a spy, while others thought it was payback for what he had done outside of prison. The scariest theory was that Rick hadn't been attacked by another inmate, but by someone working inside the facility, like a guard or a contractor. A number of people, including 2 former correctional officers who spoke on the condition of anonymity, said they had seen Rick acting strangely in the days before the attack. He had stopped eating most meals, kept his cell light on all the time, asked for more paper, and wrote quickly for hours at a time while stuffing notes into his mattress. One of the guards said Rick seemed paranoid, like he knew something bad was going to happen. The same guard remembered Rick asking to be moved to solitary confinement just as his request was turned down a week before the stabbing, citing safety concerns. So what exactly happened in F-12? Let's start with the logistics. Rick was put in a high-risk but separate section of the prison. This was standard practice for public figures or high-profile conduct. His neighbors weren't gang leaders or violent offenders. Most were white-collar criminals, political fraudsters, or disgraced figures from organized schemes. On paper, it was one of the safer wings in Black Ridge, but according to prison officials, one former warden said, "Those wings are where the guards get comfortable. They think these guys aren't dangerous, and that's when mistakes happen or people look the other way." Mistakes or purposeful blind eyes seemed to be the only way someone could sneak into Rick's cell, stab him multiple times with a weapon that wasn't found, and then disappear without a trace. Medical records show that Rick had 3 deep stab wounds, one in his lower back. Placement of the wounds suggests the attacker came from behind, possibly while Rick was sitting or lying down. The wounds were not meant to scare or intimidate, they were meant to kill. "There's a difference between a warning and a death sentence," said Dr. Ella Morton, a former forensic surgeon who looked over the medical report at the request of a news outlet. "These wounds were precise. One was close to a lung. Another aimed for someone did this on purpose. So the question is why Rick Harrison's fame was a threat inside the prison. Was he seen as a sign of betrayal because of the crimes he committed? Or what if he had become a liability to someone much more dangerous than any other inmate?" In an emotional public interview just days after the attack, Corey Harrison said something that made people all over the country sit up and take notice. "My dad told me he was going to talk, that he was tired of hiding. He wanted to name names. Corey didn't say which names, but many people think it had to do with the more powerful people in the drug trafficking ring Rick is accused of being a part of. Names of people who were never put on trial and may still be free, as well as people with money and connections who can get inside prison walls." Rick's lawyers haven't confirmed any upcoming deals or depositions, but people familiar with the case say Rick recently asked to meet with federal investigators again. That request was recorded, but he was stabbed before the meeting could happen. To people who are paying close attention, it looks like a warning shot, but it wasn't. It was an attempt to silence him. Since the attack, security around Rick has been tightened. He is now under 24/7 surveillance in the prison infirmary, and only 2 guards are allowed to enter. All visitors must be cleared by a federal security team first. For now, Rick isn't talking to anyone, not even Corey. He hasn't, Corey said in a summer press conference. "They tell me he's recovering, but they won't let me see him. They say it's for his safety, but I don't buy it. They're afraid of what he might say." Rick's condition stabilized after a few days. He was stitched up, given antibiotics, and put on a strict monitoring schedule. But sources inside the prison say he is still mostly unresponsive, both physically and emotionally. "He just sits there," said one nurse. Eyes barely open. Investigations have been started into what happened. Internal affairs, federal oversight committees, and even private watchdog groups want to know how the attack happened, why cameras were turned off, and who knew it was going to happen. But as the weeks go by and no one is arrested, many people are starting to think that the truth may never come out. "Everyone's terrified," said a prison worker who has since been on leave. "They think this wasn't an accident. They think it was ordered." One more thing to keep in mind is that after the attack, a single sheet of paper was found tucked inside Rick's mattress. It had a list of names on it, with no dates or notes. Some of the names were familiar, but others were not. Investigators are trying to figure out what it meant, and whether it had anything to do with the trafficking case, or whether Rick was trying to record what he knew before it was too late. Corey thinks that list may hold the key to everything. Maybe he knew he wouldn't make it out alive, so he wanted to make sure the truth didn't die with him. For now, Rick Harrison is locked up, watched, and remains silent. But if his son and others are right, what happened in cell F-112 wasn't just an act of violence. It was a desperate attempt to hide a secret that someone would kill to keep hidden. Before the flashing lights, the chaos in court, the endless headlines, and the public shame, there was a quiet conversation with someone Corey Harrison had known for over 20 years and who he once thought of as a brother. That person was Austin Lee Russell, better known to the world as Chum Lee. People knew Chum Lee as the lovable, slightly goofy sidekick on Pawn Stars. He was the guy who joked around and didn't always know how much a vintage coin was worth, but he made every scene funnier. Fans loved him because he was innocent and funny, just the opposite of Rick off camera. Chum Lee was much more aware than people gave him credit for. He watched and listened, and in the shadows of a business that seemed normal, he sensed something deeply wrong. Corey told the story later, in private, 2 weeks before Rick's sentencing. It happened at the shop after hours when most of the staff had gone home. The lights were dim, and Chum Lee stood near the doorway to the storage room with his arms folded. "I need to talk to you about this," he said in a serious way that Corey rarely saw. Corey looked up with a frown while holding a box of old watches he had been cataloging for auction. "What's up? You need to tell your dad to be careful." The warning came out of nowhere, with no build-up or background. Corey laughed it off at first. "Be careful about what the trial please he's been preparing for that for a year," no, Chum Lee said, stepping forward. "Be careful about who he talks to, and what he says. If he opens his mouth in the wrong place, they won't let him walk out." Corey stopped moving as he heard Chum Lee's serious voice. He slowly set the box down, his eyebrows raising in question. "What are you even talking about?" Chum Lee looked like he wasn't sure if he should go on. He looked toward the back of the shop where the security cameras were, and then lowered his voice even more. "There were things I saw, Corey. Things that never made sense, late night meetings, shipments that didn't match any invoices, guys coming in and out of the back room for no reason." Corey shook his head and said that was just business. Chum Lee stepped closer and said that wasn't business. That wasn't real business. "You think I don't remember that night in 2014 when 2 guys showed up with a locked case and Rick sent me out the front door to hold customers up for an hour, or how he kept a second ledger locked in the safe that you weren't allowed to see?" Corey didn't answer because deep down he knew he had to. He just didn't want to connect the dots on those nights either. Chum Lee sighed. "Look, I didn't want to believe it either. But I started asking questions, and the more I asked, the less sense it made. That's why I stepped back. That's why I stopped coming around as much." He knew I was suspicious. Corey was quiet for a long time before finally saying, "Why are you telling me this now? If he says something in court or to the wrong person in prison, he's a dead man." Those were the words that stuck with Corey, and now that the stabbing has happened, they sound like a prophecy. For years, Chum Lee played the fool on TV, but off camera, he had put together a different story. He saw things that no one else did, or maybe they chose not to see. The late night visits, the strange cash transactions, the customers who never bought anything but stayed behind for long, quiet conversations. He remembered one man in particular. He was tall, had a snake-like tattoo, and always met Rick in the office. Once Chumley asked Rick about him. "That's nobody," Rick snapped, "just a supplier." But what was he supplying? After Rick was arrested, Chumley disappeared. He turned off his phone, deleted most of his social media accounts, and avoided all contact with the media. Some said he ran away to Utah. Others said he was hiding, and there were even conspiracy theories that he had gone into witness protection. None of these were proven to be true, but his absence and the after-the-prison stabbing, Chumley only came back to the public's attention for a short time. He was caught by paparazzi outside of a Henderson gas station when asked if he had heard what happened to Rick. He paused, stared into the distance, and said, "Told him they'd get him if he talked." He then got in his car and drove away. That short quote sparked new questions. What did Chumley know? What had he seen? And why, after everything, was he still afraid to say more? According to Corey Chumley, Chumley was one of the first people to pick up on the story. Rick's behavior changed years ago. He stopped trusting people. Corey said in a recent podcast, he stopped letting us see his finances and even put a padlock on his office door, which was new. He became paranoid, or maybe he wasn't paranoid at all. He might have just known the walls were closing in. The conversation Corey and Chumley had in the dark shop hallway wasn't the only warning. A few days before the sentencing, Chumley gave Corey a flash drive and said, "Just in case. If anything happens to me or him, this should be sent to the press." At first, Corey didn't look at it because he was afraid of what it might contain. But after Rick was stabbed, he opened it. The contents of that flash drive are still unknown. But Corey hinted that it contained documents, emails, photos, and other proof that Rick was connected to larger networks operating in multiple states, and maybe even other countries. It seems that someone knew about that drive. Reporters have tried many times to reach Chumley, but have been unable to do so. His phone goes to voicemail and emails bounce back. He's not responding to any calls or emails. However, his warning lives on. He was trying to protect us. Corey admitted in his own way that he didn't say everything, but he did say enough and I didn't listen. Looking back, there were many red flags surrounding Chumley's sudden decrease in activity. Chumley's refusal to be in the shop and his sudden withdrawal from Rick are signs that Corey may have seen something even more than he did. Someone once told me that once you get in deep, you either get out early or get buried with it. At the time, I thought he was exaggerating, but now I see what he meant. For Corey, the tragedy isn't just that his father was involved in something illegal. It's that the people who loved him either didn't see it or didn't care. In Chumley's usual mysterious way, he tried to change that. That could be why he disappeared. He may be trying to keep himself safe, or he may know that speaking out would have far worse effects than public scrutiny. Either way, his warning is one of the most haunting parts of this whole story. It was whispered in the dim light of a pawn shop hallway, and it now echoes through hospital hallways and prison walls. They won't let him go free. Rick Harrison's fall from grace wasn't sudden. It happened over time, and boundaries, morals, and lines became blurred until the man who once stood for quirky Americana and pop culture capitalism became involved in a world that existed in the shadows. While people watched him haggle over antique swords and signed baseballs, something darker was taking root behind closed doors and away from the cameras. Was the change from a TV star to someone who worked dangerously close to a criminal organization? To understand how Rick Harrison allegedly built a network of trafficking and money laundering through a pawn empire, we must first look back to his early days in business. Rick started in Las Vegas long before the cameras came. He came from a family of pawnbrokers and learned the hard work of selling used things from his father, Richard the Old Man Harrison. Together, they ran the gold and silver pawn shop. Pawn shop was a small business that did well by making deals with the city's many gamblers, tourists, and collectors. It seemed like honest work, but in the late 1990s, rumors spread that the shop was connected to an illegal network of cash transactions, including the discreet exchange of unregistered weapons and off-the-books jewelry dealing. At the time, these rumors were buried under the romanticized story of Vegas hustling, but years later, those whispers would come to the surface. Resurface with a vengeance by 2003, the pawn shop had already become a hub for illegal deals. While most customers came for legitimate sales, some buyers came back over and over again, always paying cash and rarely haggling. According to former employees who later testified under a seal, these buyers weren't interested in pawn goods. They were using the shop as a way to transfer and clean money. One anonymous former employee later gave an affidavit to investigators that described these people. "I used to joke that the backroom did more business than the front, and it was true. But things changed when the History Channel greenlit Pawn Stars in 2009. The show was a huge hit, making Rick and his crew famous around the world. With that fame came a lot of money and opportunities. The store's foot traffic tripled, their profits went through the roof, but most importantly, their reach grew. People from all walks of life came in with things like gold bars and rare coins. But investigators say that the extra attention was the perfect way for Rick to expand his illegal business. He realized early on that the show made him untouchable, said one FBI source. He had an image, a brand. Who would have thought that America's favorite pawnbroker was also using his shop to move human cargo? The claims weren't just about stolen goods or fake documents. By 2014, Rick's name started showing up on unconfirmed federal watch lists linked to a suspected trafficking ring. Although he wasn't officially being investigated at the time, raids on nearby businesses found links to the gold and silver pawn shop. However, Rick stayed one step ahead. He built on his TV persona by writing books, selling merchandise, and giving speeches. He met famous people, politicians, and business people, and he was invited to charity galas and national events. The mask was perfect, but behind the scenes, more sinister things were going on. Investigative journalists were looking into him, discovered that Rick had set up a lot of shell corporations over the course of 8 years, many of them offshore and hard to track down. Some of these companies were linked to wire transfers totaling over $12 million going through locations in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and Panama. What were these companies? Their stated purpose was collectible consultancy, but they didn't have any employees, websites, or public records of actual business being conducted. One forensic expert called them smoke screens. Just bank accounts with fancy names to move money around. What was even scarier were the links to several people who were later arrested for human trafficking. Victor Ramos, a convicted trafficker who worked out of Southern California, was linked to Rick through an LLC they co-owned for a short time in 2012. The company, Southwest Cultural Acquisitions, was supposed to buy and restore historical artifacts from Mexico and Central America, but it was really just a front for Rick to make money. People were moved around under the guise of transportation workers and domestic workers. Rick said he had never met Ramos, but business records showed otherwise. Photos of the two shaking hands at a conference in Las Vegas in 2013 showed them together, but Rick still denied any connection other than an accident. But the connections didn't end there. Internal emails leaked from Rick's personal server showed conversations with foreign buyers using encrypted messaging apps. These conversations were about inventory. While these terms might seem like vague business language, investigators said they were actually coded references to illegal trade. One email sent to a contact in Eastern Europe said, "Read need to confirm if the 3 items are intact. Documents will be handled on this side. Ensure no interruptions during trance. Payment arrives in 3 parts." This email was sent just 2 months before 3 undocumented women were found abandoned and without identification at a Las Vegas airport. When asked questions, none of them spoke English, and all 3 refused to say how they got there. They also refused to testify. Within weeks, they were quietly deported. One of the women told a journalist in Honduras, "They told us we were going to a museum. We didn't know it would be a prison." As Rick's business grew, he relied more and more on loyal employees. Those who questioned certain transactions were fired, and those who stayed were either involved or kept in the dark. Corey now thinks that his father ran a second business completely behind the pawn shop's walls. "I thought we were just moving antiques and collectibles. I didn't know there was another door behind the back wall," he said. I didn't want to know Rick's mastery was in deception. The front of the business looked nice and was well lit. The real it seemed like business did best in the dark, and the more popular the show got, the more untouchable Rick felt. He thought that his invincibility was his shield and eventually his downfall. By 2019, federal investigators were closing in. They had informants, whistleblowers, and a growing stack of surveillance data. But Rick was careful. He used burner phones, never kept physical records at the shop, met clients in hotels or rental houses far from the city center, changed cars often, and never sent direct bank transfers through middlemen until someone finally caught him. In 2021, a former assistant named D. Lopez turned over important documents to the FBI. These included a list of Rick's clients, photos of them, account information, and voice recordings of him talking about shipments and coded language. This was the final straw. Lopez told police, "I wish I had said something earlier, but I was scared." He had people everywhere. Now, years after those first shady deals in the 1990s, Rick is in jail, and the empire he built is in pieces. Some say this is just the start. Lopez warned in a confidential statement that he wasn't the only one, and they won't stop just because he's in prison. That's what scares Corey the most, that this isn't over even after all of this, the arrest, the stabbing, and the news stories. He was part of something bigger. He didn't start it, he just kept it going. Now that he's down, someone else will step in unless it all comes to light. The story of Rick Harrison. The fall of a celebrity is a cautionary tale about how power is perceived and the dangerous illusion of innocence. It's also a story about how evil can hide in plain sight right behind a smiling face on cable TV. But inside Black Ridge Correctional Facility, the rules are different. The law and codes of justice that decide guilt or innocence don't matter much behind the heavy iron doors that shut the prison off from the rest of the world. Here, power is based on fear and control. Reputation is important, but it's not everything. Inmates don't care if you were on the History Channel or if millions of people knew your name. In this setting, you start from zero, and in the case of Rick Harrison, you may start below that. When he entered Black Ridge, Rick Harrison was already a target. He was famous, wealthy, convicted of horrible crimes related to trafficking, and rumored to be thinking about working with federal agents. Those four things alone are enough to make anyone a target. Notoriety and danger go hand in hand, but before the stabbing, the collapse, and the sound of the emergency alarms in cell block F, the warning signs were already a part of Rick's new life. Unlike what most people think of when they think of prison, Rick wasn't thrown in with the other prisoners right away. Because he was famous, he was put in a unit that was only for inmates who were seen in the media, had mental health problems, or had received threats before they were locked up. At the very least, his assignment may have made things worse. According to several former prison officials who worked at Black Ridge and similar facilities, inmates in these special units often face a different kind of torture that isn't always visible. Isolation may reduce physical fights, but it also increases paranoia, mental decline, and makes it easier for enemies to work in silence. "You're not invisible just because you're not in the yard," said one former Black Ridge guard. As sobering as it is, being in protective custody makes it easier for someone to get to you. There are fewer witnesses, more blind spots, and fewer eyes. Even the safe zones aren't safe when the right people are in charge. Rick had asked for a single cell early on, saying that other inmates had made threats against him. The prison's official records don't show that he received any written threats before the attack, but multiple staff members later confirmed that Rick had complained of being harassed. Inmates reportedly passed notes under his door, made rude threats during meal deliveries, and used coded gestures during yard times to let him know they were watching. He became paranoid. One guard said Rick would knock on the door 4 or 5 times a day just to see if the cameras were still working. Another guard said Rick started asking for extra meal inspections because he was afraid his food might have been tampered with. At first, some people thought he was exaggerating, but others knew he wasn't. A former supervisor admitted he was being targeted. Guys didn't like that he was famous, that he had a private cell, or the rumor that he might be talking to the feds. Inside prison, snitches or even suspected snitches are looked down upon more than murderers, rapists, or gang leaders. In some facilities, just the hint of cooperation is enough to get you stabbed, strangled, or even killed. And Rick wasn't just said to be cooperating. By the time the rumors started going around, there was talk that he had been in touch with a federal prosecutor about trading information for leniency and unrelated investigations. It's unclear if those talks ever went further, but inside Black Ridge, what people think is what is real. Prison power isn't just about who's physically strong or most feared. It's also about alliances, access, and leverage. There are groups, sometimes gangs and sometimes loose affiliations, that run the prison like an invisible government. If you're not in with one of them, you're out, and that usually means you're exposed. Rick didn't have any allies. He came in alone and stayed alone. He didn't have a gang membership, an inner circle, or long-term criminal connections to lean on. His fame made him stand out, but not in a good way. To many of the other inmates, Rick stood for wealth, privilege, and corruption. He was a man who played by different rules outside and might still be trying to do the same things inside. He thought his name. One inmate reportedly told a reporter that names don't matter here. As the days went on, Rick became more isolated. He refused to take part in activities, avoided the common areas, and started sleeping with his light on, which was a clear sign to those in the know of fear. He asked to see the prison chaplain several times, but it's not clear if these were for spiritual counseling or just to get out of his cell for an hour. Meanwhile, the rumors spread faster. One rumor said Rick had brought into prison a list of co-conspirators he planned to hand over. Another said he was trying to buy protection through outside contacts. A third, more sinister theory said Rick had already spoken and that his continued survival was a threat to powerful people inside and outside the system. This is where the internal power dynamics really come into play. Black Ridge, like many high-security prisons, has an ecosystem of unofficial influence. Guards have favorites. Inmates have preferences. There are many ways to get rid of someone without being held responsible, and sometimes it's not about a direct order. Permission is all it takes. Turn off a camera, take a long break, or put someone in the wrong cell. That's what seemed to have happened with Rick. On the day of the stabbing, several shifts changed. 2 regular guards were replaced with substitutes because of what were later called personal emergencies. One of the security cameras near Rick's cell was found to have been broken for 3 days. The weapon was never found, and no inmate has ever admitted to having it. That level of accuracy doesn't happen without coordination. It suggests a silent green light. Someone let everyone know that if Rick was killed, no one would stop it. Who had that much power? Some think it was an inside job. Other theories say that the order came from outside in the form of coded messages, bribes, or threats made to someone Rick had unknowingly crossed. Still others say that it wasn't about what Rick did, but what he stood for. For many inmates, especially those involved in organized crime, Rick's downfall was a lesson in how to behave. He built an empire on image and then betrayed everything to protect himself. He didn't follow the unspoken rules of in that world. Breaking those rules is a death sentence, but Rick survived the stabbing, stitches, hospital bed, and broken ribs. Now he lives in an even more complicated level of prison society as the targeted person. He is watched all the time, moved around discreetly, and barely interacted with. Some staff avoid his cell altogether, and some inmates look down on him while others seem to respect him more for surviving the attempt on his life. He's like a ghost now, said an anonymous source. People talk about him, but no one talks to him. When he walks by, it's like the air gets thicker. From the outside, Corey feels more and more afraid. His father may have thought he could control his environment, manage his image, and stay out of harm's way. But inside Black Ridge, none of that matters. Here, survival is a currency, and Rick Harrison is running out of it. Corey Harrison hadn't slept through the night in weeks. The nightmares had started before the stabbing, and they weren't always clear. He had eerie memories of his father's conversations and scenes from the shop that kept coming back to him. But one dream stood out. He was standing in front of a mirror and not recognizing the man staring back at him. This dream, more than any others, showed how confused Corey was every day since Rick Harrison was sentenced to life in prison. To the public, Corey had been the steady one in the trio that made Pawn Stars famous. He wasn't as funny as his fans often put it, he was the normal one. He handled negotiations with a calm demeanor, rarely cracked under pressure, and seemed genuinely passionate about the business side of things. But after Rick's arrest, that identity was shattered. When the charges were first made public, Corey didn't want to believe them. His father was a trafficker and a money launderer, the man who taught him to carefully check gold and who used to say, always know the story behind and the story wasn't a good one. I kept telling myself there had to be a mistake, as Corey later said in a recorded phone call with a reporter. I thought maybe someone set him up, or maybe he got mixed up with the wrong people. I made excuses because that's what you do when it's your dad. In the days after the verdict, Corey shut down completely. He refused interviews, avoided friends, and spent most of his time alone in a private home outside of Las Vegas. Food deliveries kept coming to his door, and family members started to worry. Chumley tried to get in touch with Corey several times, but he never answered. He would later say, "Those were the darkest days I've ever known. I didn't know what was real anymore," he said. "Suddenly nothing I believed about my life, my family, or our business made sense." He started watching old episodes of the show again, not to remember them, but to look for clues. Could there have been subtle signs? Corey said he was uneasy when Rick took strange calls, avoided certain conversations, or made vague references to deals that were never explained. Then there were the letters. As word of Rick's crimes spread, people from all over the country and even other countries started writing to Corey. Some were fans who were shocked and couldn't believe what they were reading. Others were victims or their families who were telling Corey painful stories and begging him to help them. Corey said that one letter stood out. It was from a woman in Texas who said that her younger sister had worked briefly at a storage facility that Rick rented during the height of the Pawn Stars' fame. The woman disappeared 2 months into the job, and her family never found her. Years later, they learned that she had been using an alias that was linked to an undocumented trafficking case that the FBI had quietly closed. The woman wrote that she didn't blame me, but she asked me not to keep quiet, saying that my sister had been punished for her silence, was never found in time. That letter was the turning point for Corey. He realized that whether he knew about his father's crimes or not, he now had to take responsibility for them. Staying silent would only make him more guilty, and it would also leave the victim's pain unresolved. But speaking out wasn't easy. There was immediate backlash. Some fans supported him, while others said he was lying or pretending not to know. Social media became very mean, and conspiracy theories grew. Some said Corey was the real mastermind, while others said he wasn't. I couldn't win, Corey admitted. If I spoke out, they said I was fake. If I stayed quiet, they said I was guilty. Friends he had known for years turned away. Brand deals disappeared overnight. His public reputation, which had been built on reality TV and business ventures, was now in danger. Even his relationships with his extended family got tense. Some thought Rick had been set up, others were too embarrassed to talk about it. To talk about his mental health in public at all. Corey's condition got worse. He went to therapy, but he rarely talked about it in detail. He started having insomnia, lost weight, and avoided mirrors. Every day felt like walking through a minefield. One wrong move or quote would lead to another round of media speculation. His son was the only thing that kept him grounded. "My kid is the reason I'm still here," Corey said in a later interview. "I knew that if I didn't try to make things right and rise above what my dad had done, I'd also be failing him, but it was very hard to get back to feeling like myself." Every time Rick was in the news, whether it was because of the stabbing or the ongoing prison investigation, Corey's name came up again. His face would flash across screens in old clips from the show that were used in segments that talked about the tragedy of the Harrison legacy, but not many people knew the personal pain that those images showed. He had deleted every episode of Pawn Stars from his home archives and avoided walking down some streets in Vegas because they reminded him of his father. And then there was the guilt Corey felt, asking himself questions that no child should ever have to ask. Was he blind? Had he ignored warning signs? Had he defended his father for too long? What kind of man was that? People always ask him, "Did I know?" And he says, "Maybe deep down I felt something was wrong, but when someone is your hero, it's hard to accept that they're also your villain." Corey's guilt was made worse by fear after Rick's stabbing. He got anonymous letters telling him not to say too much, and 3 times a strange van showed up outside his house. He put up security cameras and sent his son to stay with his mother until things calmed down. "I don't know who to trust anymore," he admitted. "If my dad's someone still wants to hide the rest of the truth, and I'm not sure I'm ready for what will happen when it all comes out." Despite everything, Corey has tried to rebuild not only his life but also his identity. He started writing in a journal and giving money to shelters and organizations. Without giving his name, he turned down offers to talk on mainstream media shows and started working on a documentary that would not only look into his father's case but also his own. He said, "It's not just about my dad. It's about the system that let him do what he did. The people who look the other way and the money that silences questions. That's the story I want to tell now. It's unclear if Corey will ever find peace. His father's actions will always be a stain on his life, but for the first time in a long time, he's trying to move forward, not away from truth, but toward it."